I've always seen it as, my dad needed to go to work because it was a necessity. When my mom took side hustle jobs, it was because it was a necessity. And so I didn't take any of this for granted. And now that I'm here, others that are behind me might take, that bar that we've set for them, whether they're kids or whatever, grandkids someday, like that kind of stuff. Um, but I think they need to be reminded and or at least educated that that's where the sacrifices came from, so that they value where they're starting,
Mm,
as opposed to where they could have been starting.
mm. Yeah, no, I think it's a great answer because I think it gets to, again, there's no simple, clear object, at least from where I sit, objectives answers to this. And that's why I think having the conversation, as you said it a couple of times, right? We, even in trying to be honest and authentic, we have to hedge. And part of that's good because we're trying to be considerate of different viewpoints. As we said
Right.
before, people see the world
Diplomatic.
differently. But sometimes it could be detrimental because then we can't actually have the conversation and figure out, like, hey, maybe there is something to be learned here that's useful. Um, so it's interesting, like in the spirit of that, it's in some ways you're getting right to the core of like a cultural or human nature phenomenon to talk about, like this idea of, should we be okay to say life is about sacrifice and putting in the work to help others, whether that be your family or future generations, and there's implicit or inherent in that this idea that, like, you don't get a choice, you just have to do what you have to do. And today's generation, and we're generalizing a little bit, but there's a lot of people today that are like, hey, I just don't get that. It doesn't make sense to me why we should all feel like we need to sacrifice, like we don't have a choice. That sense of entitlement is more just being like, hey, we're all on this planet, we all live here, I should be able to do what I want to do. And then you could layer onto it, some people feel like there's like social pressures, or maybe you can even say conspiracy, like to make us feel like we have to work all the time and we need more money, because then it just kind of keeps our head down and not really looking to do other things in life, not rock the boat, and the powers that be can stay where they are, right? You can go a lot of different directions with this. But I think it's getting right to that question of like, is it necessarily objectively right or wrong in either direction? And I think somebody might say, like, but was your dad happy? Like, was he a happy person as he went through that? And not to speak for you, you'll correct me, I think what answer you might give is like, sure, I'm sure there was happiness, but it wasn't all about happiness. It was somewhat around this obligation of like, we are meant to sacrifice a little bit for the greater good and for others to get ahead. So I give you an equally long-winded answer to your response, and kind of just, again, swimming in that duality, swimming in that everybody's got a different perspective. How confident are you that, like, no, I've thought through this, I really do think this is the right way to be. The generations as they look at it today, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but I just don't think they have it quite right.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is, I'm sort of stuck in the middle of both, right?
Mm.
I'm not the elder generation that is going to, get off my lawn kind of thing, but I'm also not part of the participation trophy generation that, I think often uh schools people to care more about themselves than caring more about the family or the community. And again, that's an overgeneralization, right? But I think it's a fair one just based on what we're going through. I mean, look at all these folks, these fake, like the Twitter, like the just the idea that it's so narcissistic and it's so self-centered, and it's look at me, look at me, look at me, and no one ever takes a picture of them checking in at McDonald's, right? It's always they're checking in at a high-end restaurant, or look at me on vacation, or look at this beautiful thing. And look, I get it, it's part of human nature, and stuff like that. But I also think that you've lost so much privacy, and there's also this sense that when you don't respond to some of that stuff, because look, I'm for my job, I have to be on all these social media things, and I get the value of them, but I also see the destruction. It's like, and I don't get it. I if it were me, I would never. The only way I go on Facebook to watch funny videos, or I'm on Twitter to catch stuff from people that are doing things in that are related to my job, or
Mhm.
whatever it might be. It's rarely is it for fun. But to your point, I think my dad would have said exactly what you said, is I've had fun. There were moments of happiness in my life. Sure, like if he had more money, we could have traveled more. We could have done fun things. We could have gone to places, and um it would have been easier for him to turn down a shift and spend more time. But he also knew that this wasn't about him. This was about his family and his offspring, his progeny. I'm taking this one for the team so you don't have to. And I think that there's a level of, like, I keep going back to this, but there's a level of today's parent, that millennial that is having that oh crap moment to, to keep this PG, where they all of these philosophies where it's like, oh, well, I would love to do that, and now all of a sudden they've got to balance their kids, and they find out that it's a handful, right? And they weren't disciplined, and they don't understand the value of that discipline. And I don't mean like discipline
Yep.
physically. I mean there's a regimen that you need to follow. You need to finish your homework before you can go out and play. You know what I mean? You have to get your chores done before you can go out and play. You can't just choose to go and play and then address this later
Mhm.
and it's half-assed, right? Like it, and I think that's where it's been inverted. And I don't think that's culturally, a good thing. I just think, and I think we see that as much as people complain about, immigrants coming to this country, they're coming here to work. They're coming here to work. They want to be part of the American dream. They're not walking thousands of miles to get here or sneaking across the border. Now, take the politics out of it because I
Right.
believe you need to have borders. But at the end of the day, I know why they're coming here. My family did it 100 years ago, right? So I'm not going to deny anybody the right that wants to come here, and do the same because they want to work. They want to provide that for their family,
Mhm.
as opposed to, I think, this sense of entitlement that exists. And I find it difficult for anybody to argue that isn't the case these days. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear the argument against it. I get the work-life balance thing. It's a really cool concept.
Yeah.
And I try to do as much of that as I can. I have fun and I work hard, I play hard.
Yeah.
But I think that responsibility always is at the top of the list for me.
Yeah, and I think that it's a spectrum, right, of work-life balance. As you said before, some people are wired in a certain way where they just love working and they want to do it, where some aren't. What I think is interesting to the point, and firstly, let me say, I think you're right. Oh, well, let me back up one second. I think everything comes at a cost. There's pros and cons. There's balance in everything that happens. So it's very rarely where like you take a course of action and it's completely good and there's no negative, there's no cost to
Right.
it, right? So to the point about the entitlement thing, like I think it would be hard for anybody to argue that if you look at just like society as a whole, there is certainly more individualism, entitlement, trying to make it more everybody wins, as we've talked about, right? There's certainly more of that in there. I think it would be hard to argue that. If I had to try and I'm not saying I necessarily believe this, but I do think about this stuff a lot. The only thing I could think of, it was somebody might say, is like if you think of it like a pendulum, like for a while, for our parents, our grandparents, those generations, I think we're about the same age. The idea, exactly as you're explaining, of like you just do your work, you put in the time, you grind, you do what you do. There's a lot of good that comes in that. There's work ethic. We've achieved a lot of amazing things. You raise people to understand responsibility and all that. I'm not saying there's a direct connection here, but there's also a lot of ugliness in the world, right? There's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of different things that were negative. And I'm not saying it's a direct correlation that because people worked hard, there was whatever, more racism or more sexism or more just suffering that was caused for people. But I wonder if what was initially or still a good idea of like, hey, maybe we should think about this more. Maybe we should just step back and look at everything. Like, it's great, the work ethic, it's great that we're achieving great things, but there's a lot of ugliness. And maybe those things are connected in some way where we're so focused on this that we're not worried enough. We're not seeing enough of ways in which we can improve the world. And that makes sense. And then people start working towards that. And then inevitably, human nature, some people always pull that to an extreme and be like, yeah, let's take that all the way. Let's make everything great all the time. Let's make it so nobody has to suffer ever. And that's probably the best argument I could give as to like why there's something to be considered there. I think obviously going to an extreme is never a good thing. I think there's always going to be a cost, but it becomes like, I don't think there's a clear answer. It becomes a question for society and for each individual to say, which one are we better off with? And I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's super valid that we're losing something that's really valuable. If we gain something that's valuable, does it offset? I don't know. And who's to say how we gain and how much we gain? Like, you get into a very murky gray area. But
Yeah.
that's the one thing I would say about people today and how they're thinking about it. If I give the benefit of the doubt, I think that's where it's coming from. What do you think about that?